How's it going, everybody? Greg here at Gregarious Media. Welcome to the second installment of Discog Devil, where we go over one artist a week and we go over the worst to best albums in their discography, followed by a worst to best tracks review style of their most recent release. This week we go over the Welsh metal band Bullet for My Valentine. Formerly known as Jeff Kill John, they have sold over 1 million albums in the United States, 5 million worldwide. Bullet for My Valentine have released 5 albums, The Poison being their debut in 2005 and the most recent being Venom in 2015. So which of their 5 albums are the best? This is my personal list. So if this isn't your list, please tell me what your list is in the comments below. This is Discog Devil with Bullet for My Valentine. Let's get started. The worst album in Bullet for My Valentine's discography has to be Temper Temper, released in 2013. This album was a follow-up to Fever in 2009, where the band saw a little bit of a switch up in their sound, a little more melodic, a little bit more rock influence as well, a little more accessible. It was their most accessible album to date. So then Temper Temper, to me, sounds like a full transition toward the more radio rock and metal sort of sound, with very bad results. Not even part 2 of Tears Don't Fall could really save this project. There's a horrendous amount of problems with this project, starting with the fact that a lot of this stuff just sounds bland. It sounds like B-sides from Fever, but not good B-sides. There's a reason why, like, these were not on Fever, because they are just so tiresome. They don't even sound like the band's having fun on any of these. It just sounds like they're just phoning it in, trying to go for another paycheck type of album. Another big noticeable thing on this album that I'm not sure if people have been really complaining about all that much, but do you notice how low the bass is in the mix of this album? On every album that Bullet has released, and probably one of my favorite things in metal in general, is when the bass has at least some distinct, tone. Even if it's behind the rhythm guitars, just adding that additional chug. When the bass is heard, it adds this nice depth overall to the sound. This essentially just decided to do the And Justice for All thing and just cut bass almost entirely. And when you do hear the bass, it's incredibly low, which harms a lot of these songs because they sound like they're just incomplete demos a lot of the time. And when they sound like they're complete songs, they just sound like throwaways. The lyrics on this album, too, show a massive decline, which also kind of goes to the alluding to the more radio-friendly style when it comes to the rock and metal stuff. It sounded like they just dumbed down their lyrics to the lowest common denominator on a fair amount of these songs, just so that it would get some radio airplay. But another big problem is that with radio, you need hooks, and with this album, the hooks are barely noticeable, or they're just really annoying. Did anyone hear the Dirty Little Secrets melody there and then immediately think All American Rejects? Dirty little secrets, just another regret. The solos on this album, as per any Bullet from a Valentine album, are good, but unfortunately, even those on this album sound like they were just phoned in. Even the best parts on this album sound like they're pretty much just throwaways. However, not every song on this album is bad. In fact, the key 3 I would recommend from this album are Truth Hurts, Leech, and Dead to the World. Next on this list, we have Venom, the most recent release from Bullet from Valentine, released back in 2015. Now, this saw more of a return to their thrashier sound, sort of their more metalcore sound. It was kind of more of a fusion of the first 3 records. It had a little more of the straightforward, streamlined sounds that were presented in Fever, with a little bit of the Poison and Scream Aim Fire in the riffs, and occasionally some of the rhythm sections. Now, this was, I think, what Temper Temper should have been. Unfortunately, even though this album is leagues higher than Temper Temper, there are still very noticeable issues with this, which is why it's at number 4 on my list. The lyrics only improve slightly on this album when compared to Temper Temper. Most of the lyrics are kind of rehashed and sort of the angsty writings of a teenager type of thing. which aren't the worst thing in the world because Bullet has done this style for every album but have done it really well. I understand that Matt was trying to go back to his style of writing in The Poison, but it kind of sounds like the older man trying to give an angsty impersonation of his younger self. And it comes off with very mixed results. A lot of the riffs on here are kind of recycled too, but at least the instrumentals on here, for the most part, have at least some interesting quality. And the bass is actually in this album, so it does add at least a fullness to the overall composition. For the most part, this album is done really well. A lot of these songs are pretty straightforward and to the point. Some, I think, could have been fleshed out a little bit more, and there are a couple songs that sound really phoned in. But there are other really big highlights on this album that I think could potentially see sort of staying power in Bullet from a Valentine's overall set lists live. Unfortunately, while this is a return to a better form than it was on Temper Temper, they still got a little bit more to go, and I hope that the album that they come out with after this is a little more fleshed out in the songwriting and lyrical aspects. The key three from this album I'd recommend are Army of Noise, Broken, and Hell or High Water. For the bronze spot at number 3, we have Fever, released back in 2009, I think? This showed Bullet from a Valentine going for a more streamlined approach with a little bit more of an accessible, melodic, and even rock-influenced sort of tone throughout the album. Now, this is where a lot of fans, or some fans, I should say, started feeling like there was a bit of a decline in the quality of Bullet's music, in which I can kind of see where they're coming from. I mean, there's a reason why this is number 3 at the list. I think you know what the other two are. However, I would argue that the high points on this album would rival with some of the best moments from the previous albums. In fact, while this album is more accessible and a little bit more of a mainstream approach to their songwriting, they do a lot of things right on this album. This album opens up with Your Betrayal, which has so much of a build-up that's just really nice and gripping. Then the title track has this really nice groove. The Last Fight, which is one of my favorite songs, in fact, I'd say it is my favorite song on the album, does have a little bit more of a rock-influenced sound, but it does mesh so well together. And it talks about a friend going through drug addiction and that they're not your enemy. Like, I'm not your enemy. The drugs are. While there's definitely still some thrashier moments, which have been pretty much in Bullet's formula since The Poison and more so on Scream Aim Fire, this album does experiment a little bit more with melody in the guitars and Matt's voice. And I think this album does both of those things really well. While lyrically there are a few spots that I think showed a bit of decline. Take the title track, for example. You smell so fucking good. That lyric does not age well. You have a lot of variety on this album that just works really well. And every song sounds like, despite the fact that each song kind of has its own certain twist and style to it, it does flow together really well as an album, even if there are some lower points. It doesn't sound out of place. I don't know how they went from this to Temper Temper. I'm still never going to understand that. Key 3 from this album are The Last Fight, Alone, and Breaking Out, Breaking Down. At number 2, we got the debut. For the silver, we got The Poison. Released back in 2005, this was huge for Bullet for My Valentine. Right at the, I would argue, peak of mainstream metalcore popularity. Huge singles from here. Tears Don't Fall, All These Things I Hate Revolve Around Me, Forwards Choke Upon, Suffocating Under the Words of Sorrow. Why do I feel like I might have said that wrong? Why didn't I write that down in these notes? The debut showed a very strong sense of melody while still being pretty heavy, considering, and it even infused a little bit of, arguably, emo, since Matt's vocals were a little bit on the higher end and a little bit on the rougher end during that period of time. A slight bit of whine in the screams, but honestly, the way that this album is mixed just works really well with it. The introduction of this album featured Apocalyptica, which then goes right into Her Voice Resides, which is just an absolute punch to the face. which is something that I think Venom was trying to do with The and No Way Out, but is done much better on this album. Then you pretty much have the stream of hits: 4 Words to Choke Upon, Tears Don't Fall, Suffocating Under Words of Sorrow, then Hit the Floor, all these things I hate revolve around me. Like, I enjoy, honestly, every single song on here, despite the fact that maybe a couple of tracks don't hit me quite as well as I initially enjoyed them. This album still holds up really well, considering it's been over a decade since its release. And maybe that's just because I'm kind of a sucker for some metalcore that has some nice melodies and some thrashier rhythms to it, and it's not just beat down after beat down after beat down. I love you, Code Orange. I think songwriting was a big reason why I enjoyed this album so much, because for a metalcore album, there was just a lot on here for each individual track that stood out. The key 3 for this album are 4 Words, Hit the Floor, and the title track, The Poison. And at number 1 for the gold of this countdown, my favorite album, in which my former roommate has the vinyl of this, and I'm super goddamn jealous, Scream, Aim, Fire. This album showed more of a transition toward traditional thrash music, whereas The Poison, while had some thrash elements, was still very much in the metalcore scene. And I'm kind of a sucker for thrash metal, so that's probably why I have Scream Aim over The Poison overall, but I think the songwriting on here actually exceeds a lot of what's on The Poison too. I think it's a lot tighter. I think the production is a little bit more polished so that it's still heavy enough, but it's not so rough on the ears. The rhythms on here are just fantastic. The melodies, the screaming, the riffs. I mean, I could just go on and on about this album if I really want to, but I'm going to try to condense it just so that I'm not rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling. This was the first album I actually heard from Bullet from a Valentine. So then when I went back and listened to The Poison, both of those were pretty equal to me during middle school and high school. But the more and more I listened to Scream Aim, the more and more it just sort of resonated with me. And I think that's because, 1, I am a sucker for thrash metal, but 2, I think the songwriting on here, right from the beginning, the opening fucking drums from the title track, and then into Waking the Storm, which is just another 1-2 thrash banger, into Heart Bursts into Fire, which is a little more on the more accessible and melodic side, but it still was metal. And then Waking the Demon, which was probably one of the heaviest singles they've ever released. And yes, the album version is significantly better than the ones with the just clean vocals on the verses. I don't know why they ever bothered releasing that. Maybe for TV purposes, I guess, but no, stick with the Waking the Demon on this album. Say Goodnight, Take It Out on Me, and Forever and Always, which is a much more just mid-tempo melodic anthem that closes the standard version of this album off just perfectly. It might go on just a little bit too long at the end where the instruments just kind of don't seem to go out when they need to, but even then, I don't really have any complaints about this album. From front to back, I can listen to this and enjoy every single track for every individual merit that this album has. Scream Aim is my number 1. Social media and all that down below, and also a playlist to Discog Devil episodes from last week, System of a Down, will be up as well. Following this video, there will be an album review, worst to best tracks of their last release, Venom. Stay tuned. See you in the next video.